Good afternoon and welcome to the final session for this year of the Atlantic Theological Conference being held here in Halifax at St. George's Church. As we're all aware, the overall topic for the conference, which we've been advertising for quite a number of months now, was burning churches and sacred spaces. And our website has been saying the conference will explore the reasons why we set aside places of worship, why we love them, take trouble over their beauty, and lament their loss. We'll be bearing in mind the great outcry when Notre Dame Cathedral burned in 2020, and locally in Halifax, we'll recollect the fire at St. George's Round Church in 1994. I think we can say that the papers we've heard, first three papers, dealt very adequately with the first half of that paragraph. And what we've heard today, and they're about to hear this afternoon, really pertain to the second sentence. We'll be bearing in mind the great outcry when Notre Dame burned and also recollecting the fire here at St. George's. We considered the Notre Dame Cathedral fire in the paper Dr. Elson presented to us this morning. And now this afternoon, the paper from Susan Harris will bring us to consider St. George's and also, in another sense, the dilemma of smaller and struggling churches and congregations in general. And I'm going to call upon Matthew Vanderquack now to introduce Susan Harris as our speaker this afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to introduce Susan Harris, someone known very well to many of us. Susan is a graduate of University of King's College and of Mount St. Vincent University. Susan has worked for a number of years in the Dalhousie University Library System, retiring a few years ago from the position of library specialist, digital scholarship, and subject specialist for classics and German at the Killam Library. Susan is also an esteemed member of the Atlantic Theological Conference Planning Committee and editor of the conference reports. Here at St. George's, she is a member of the Spiritual Development Committee, has been a warden in the past, and is a great accomplisher of things behind the scenes, as well as being a coordinator of the deaf ministry. When I think about Susan Harris at St. George's, what I think about is the very first time Amy and I came to a Sunday service here in 2016, and Susan was the very first person at the end of the service to introduce herself to us. And she has continued with great care to remind us that this is our home, and for that I'm very grateful. So please, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Originally, my paper was intended to be a response to the main paper, so I crave your pardon for the deficiencies that I know you will notice as I proceed. I suspect that you will find this to be the lightweight paper of this conference. For those looking for a more learned and thoughtful consideration of the subject of church closures, I would refer you to a fine paper by Father David Curry, Iconoclasm or Idolatry, which I did not see myself until too late for me to use it in the writing of this paper. The suggested title was The Restoration of St. George's Church and the Loss of Rural Churches in the Maritimes. And indeed, that's what this paper will attempt to center itself around. For the first part of my paper, I'm making use of a couple of documents, especially the St. George's Parish Proposal for Restoration, submitted to the bishop in January of 1995, and also a very moving collection of the recollections of parishioners and friends of the parish called A Collection of Memories of the Fire at St. George's in June 1994, which we began to put together 2 years ago when we marked the 25th anniversary of the fire. My purpose here is to consider the importance to us still in this time and in this part of the world of our places of worship, in particular, the importance of our local parish churches. At this conference, we have been exploring the reasons why we set them aside, why we love them, take trouble over their beauty, lament their loss, why they're so important to us. We have heard from the Old Testament about the sacred spaces so carefully set aside for the worship of God, of the sorrow following the destruction of the temple. We have heard about the true home we find in Dante's Paradiso and of the impact of the burning of Notre Dame in Paris, in France, and indeed throughout the world 2 years ago. Now it is time to bring this overall topic home to Nova Scotia. And there are going to be some images up online, which Jordan is looking after, but what they are of the three large photographs at the back of the church representing the fire, the days right afterwards, and then the time of the putting on of the dome. So if you want to crane your neck and look around at any point, there they are. St. George's Round Church. On our website, you can read these words. In response to the gospel of Jesus Christ, the parish of St. George offers a unique combination of traditional Anglican worship and a commitment to inner city ministry. Open to the community that surrounds it, St. George's dares to be shaped by the inner city, yet seeks to transform our neighborhood by preaching in word and action the gospel of Jesus Christ. I want to begin with the particular experience of the parish thus characterized above, this parish in which our conference is meeting. And I will move on to more general comments about parish life in this part of the world, and finally some thoughts about what a parish church can and should be in people's lives. As a parishioner of this parish of St. George in 1994, when our church burned, I have an immediate and visceral memory of what it was like to feel the loss of one's parish church. On June 2nd, 1994, as parishioners, together with the people of our neighborhood, thronged the streets around this beautiful church and watched in horror as the fire raged through the building, we supposed that all had been lost. All around, people were weeping, and a great cry went up when the cupola fell in. Despite the heroic efforts of the members of the fire department, one could only assume the worst. During the 25th anniversary year after the fire, the parish compiled a collection of memories of the fire, bringing together the recollections of parishioners and friends of the parish from that terrible time. I will include some of these reflections here with the hope of bringing home to you all the feeling of loss we experienced following the apparent destruction of our parish church. I will begin with my own initial experience of that night. On the evening of the fire, I had been invited to dinner along with a number of other people, and as I arrived at the door, the woman who was hosting us greeted me with words I will never forget. She said, "Susan, I don't want to have to tell you, but I have to tell you, your church is on fire." I still remember my feeling of disbelief and fear and despair. With several of the others invited to the dinner party, I immediately hastened to the church to watch helplessly as the fire engulfed the building. One may parenthetically feel sorry for our hostess with her carefully prepared meal sitting abandoned on the table, though she seemed remarkably understanding. Much of the rest of this section of the paper is in the words of others, as gathered in our collection of memories. From a parishioner who was one of our daily office officials at that time. It was my assigned day to lead evening prayer at St. George's. Based on my experience, one or two other members of the congregation might come to take part. Someone entered. At the appointed hour, we read the service. Once we were finished, I put things back in order and put out the candles. I locked the door of the church behind me as we both left. My plan was now to go for my routine half-hour run. I lived up the street from the church, and as I was running and approaching the church, I could see the flames coming from the porch, and for the briefest moment, I tried to make sense of that fact. In the very same breath, I turned and bolted home and ran in, grabbed the phone, and reported the fire. From another parishioner. All I wanted to do was get there. As I got to the downtown area, I could see smoke in the distance. My heart sank. It was inconceivable that our beautiful church would be no more. There was a brisk north wind that night which blew the smoke in our direction. The church from that view looked to be wrapped in a shroud. The air was acrid. Bystanders were not permitted to go further down Brunswick Street as flames appeared over the main front doors. Then we saw the collapse of the dome and there was a scream from the crowd. It became evident that we might actually lose the church altogether. I can still see the front door standing open. The building looked totally helpless as the firefighters aimed their water cannons inside. I began to notice other parishioners just walking around looking dazed. Father Gary Thorne, the rector at the time, moved through the crowd, offering what comfort he could. From still another parishioner, I was teaching piano students the afternoon of the fire, and afterwards, 5 p.m., my last student of the afternoon flew into the house and wanted me to know that he had been listening to the radio in his car and there was breaking news that St. George's Church in Halifax was burning. There was no way I could concentrate on his lesson. So in a dreadful state of unbelief and great trepidation, I was driven down to the Dartmouth ferry landing. Directly across the harbor was a clear view of the flames licking away at the cupola, and my sense of unbelief and horror was deeply heightened. It was impossible. And from yet another parishioner, as Halley's Comet slowly capsized and fell, it was one of the few occasions that I have felt such a deep sense of sorrow, almost despair. Father Thorne calling us to prayer helped turn my mood past despair to a glimmer of hope for the future. From a newcomer to the parish in 1994. At the time of the fire, I was a comparative newcomer to the parish and knew only a few members of the congregation personally. Rather than succumbing to the tremendous pressures placed on it after the fire, I saw the congregation rise to the challenge by maintaining its liturgical identity while overcoming the physical devastation presented by the fire. Instead of leaving the physical confines of the parish, the parishioners held fast to their corporate identity by conducting services in the parish hall, sharing space with the weekly soup kitchen and other parish activities. This honorable old structure became the focal point for an entire round of worship that had been previously offered in our parish church. In my own comment here, the next day, after the smoke had cleared, it was discovered that though roughly a third of the building had been destroyed by the fire, enough remained for us to live in hope that it might somehow be restored. From our music director at that time, writing about the days after the fire, we hear, the organ, newly restored and with a brand new console, was in very sad shape. Although wooden pipes remained and had not burned, the water damage was thorough. Fernand Letourneau, our organ builder, came to make an assessment for insurance purposes. He arrived quite soon after the fire, perhaps on the Saturday. Already, fantastically colored mold had begun to grow on the leather and other surfaces of the instrument in the organ proper. The console was unplayable, the keys swollen beyond hope. He cried as he surveyed the remains and suggested that felt to him like losing a child. The parish had sacrificed so much to have this ancient instrument restored and only been able to use it since January of that year. And back to my own comments. Over the next 6 years, this church was lovingly restored by the congregation with lots of blood, sweat, and tears, and with prayerful and financial support from across the country and indeed from around the world. The story of the restoration and all that it entailed is far too long to include in full here, but if anyone is interested, there's a splendid book about the long history of this parish written by Elizabeth Pacey called Miracle on Brunswick Street, which includes in-depth coverage of the aftermath of the fire and the restoration of the church. One final quote from a parishioner, and this I think is something that we all went through and which is very nicely captured. It's easy to look back now and think, yes, those were terrible months of discernment and determination, but it all worked out just fine. It's difficult to put into words the strain of the uncertainty as to what would happen to the building, the parishioners, and the effect of closure would have on our neighborhood. All these years later, knowing that the church would be restored and the parish renewed, the terrifying images from the night of June 2nd, 1994, are now easily seen as a refiner's fire, prompting the parish to renewed vision of mercy for parishioners, our neighbors, and the relationships between the two. Let me end this section on the restoration of St. George's by quoting the words of our current rector, Father Nicholas Hatt. Early on in my time as rector, I sat at our weekly soup kitchen with one of our neighbors, who reminded me that it cost over $5 million to restore the church. Think of all the better things you could have done with that money, he said. Before I could reply, he added, but the community wanted the church rebuilt, so it was worth it. I trust that he was right. That the round church was restored remains a miracle. We give thanks that Almighty God has seen fit to restore our beloved church, and we pray that we have been faithful to our vocation to serve God and our neighbor in this place. And we seek forgiveness for the ways in which we have failed him and one another in that vocation. We pray for the Lord's ongoing protection and grace, that we may be found an acceptable people in his sight. I want to begin the next section of my paper with a quotation from the presentation made by St. George's to the Right Reverend Arthur Peters, the Bishop of the Diocese at the time of the fire, which outlines the reasons for the restoration of this particular church, but has, I think, some application to parish churches generally. Quote, the grief that was felt on June 2nd by the parishioners of St. George's was a grief at the loss of not the essential fabric of our faith or of the inner core of our community, but it was the grief of suffering a loss of an aspect of what makes us the particular worshiping community we are. Certainly the fire has not destroyed the parish of St. George and has therefore been for us an opportunity to recognize that the church building is not an essential element of what draws us to worship God, but that is not to say that the church building does not serve a necessary role in our being the worshiping community we are. Indeed, we have, since the fire, been sustained in our particularity by a hope that our church might be rebuilt in its particularity. We have lived in this hope, even to the point of maintaining as we can the forms of worship our church both allowed and required. We see the restoration of St. George's as a continuing witness to our love of God and a renewal of our commitment to be his people in this place. We would be doing a disservice to our neighbors not to express our love and respect for this community by engaging in the restoration effort. We must make no mistake in this. Our failure to carry through with restoration would be seen as a failure of our commitment to love our neighbors. It would be interpreted, and rightly so, as an uncaring act of abandonment of our neighbors near and far. We firmly believe that the restoration of this church in this place can and must be, with God's help, the expression of our love of him and our love of our neighbors. We believe our particular Christian calling lies with this restoration and with no other option. End of that quotation. It seems to me that recognizing what is particular about a parish, what makes the parish what it is, might just be the nub of the matter. What is particular to St. George's is not at all the same for St. Mark's, St. Paul's, the Cathedral, or any other parish in the city. What is particular to any given rural parish may be very different from the one just a few communities down the road. Each has its own particular features, dare I say quirks, that have developed over the years in the crucible of joys and sorrows as people have prayed together, experiencing life's ups and downs together, and finding their way through challenges and hard times within and around the walls of their church. Why do we so often associate our parish with our parish church? We surely recognize, as noted above, that the church building is not an essential element of what draws us to worship God. But nonetheless, it is a place where we are able to offer a continuing witness to our love of God and a renewal of our commitment to be his people in the place where we are planted. And in the same way that we love our family and friends, those people who are nearest and dearest to us, we also love particular places, especially sacred places, which are near and dear to us. These are often the places in which we have been formed as Christians, in which we have marked the important changes in our personal and communal lives. In the early years of these maritime provinces, and no doubt in many other places as well, small and rural communities tended to grow up around the need of people to earn a living. And thus we have fishing villages, farming communities, villages based around mills in the forestry industry, and so on. Very often, after the building of their houses, the next building to be raised, often as a joint activity by the entire community, would have been the church. This was perhaps the first chance to come together as a community, drawing people together in love of God and neighbor. In many ways, these early communities formed themselves around their church. So often these days, when something newsworthy happens in a small community, the first comment by its inhabitants is that it is a close-knit community. In some cases, this may be as much aspirational as actual, but it shows the very real sense people have that a close-knit community is what we hope and long for and should have. As more and more small churches in rural areas face dissolution or the threat of dissolution, we have to consider what this loss will mean to communities and their people. In many cases, these communities have already seen the loss of their other institutions, schools, post offices, banks, grocery stores. The church has been, in some cases, the only remaining center of community in which people of all sorts and conditions gather together naturally and without reference to status. Churches are not clubs. They're meant to be places for conversion, places where we encounter Christ in word and sacrament and in our neighbor, and experience the assurance of our Lord's presence with us in the body. The loss of the church as a center of community is far from inconsequential. It is sometimes a signal that the community is no longer the cohesive place it once was. The complex considerations of what to do with church buildings seriously damaged by fire or natural disaster, and what to do with church buildings now deemed surplus to requirements, and which are either gradually abandoned by a congregation or closed by ecclesiastical authorities, is a serious, growing, and evolving issue for Christians, and certainly in the rural Maritimes, it is a very real live issue. As one drives through the countryside, as often as not, the steeple one spies just around the next corner belongs to a church that has been converted into an antique shop or a music venue or a private home. Or perhaps it is attached to an unpainted and collapsing building, a sad reminder of its better days. But we can't just view these changes as someone's fault and long sentimentally for the good old days, tempting though that may be. No doubt the demographic changes in the rural areas of Nova Scotia, fewer families with lots of children, fewer families with any children, have brought about many of these changes. In this time when few understand the point of maintaining a connection with former days when the church was so central to the community, let alone the centrality the church might still have. But in recent years, some rural areas are seeing an influx of people. Some retirees from other parts of our province or even farther afield, others young people with a genuine desire to live a simpler life in closer relation to the land and with a more genuine relationship to their neighbors. So farm markets have sprung up, and artisans and musicians and farmers raising water buffalo and llamas, for example, are a lively part of rural life in many areas. There is a shared sense of community and a love of the life that is possible in rural areas. Under the right circumstances, might this be the church's moment to return to a renewed role within its community? A critical difficulty for rural congregations is the inability to attract a parish priest. This is often due to financial constraints, but also it is not infrequently due to the lack of clergy willing to move to the rural areas. The siren songs of the city make many clergy and their families want to stay there and not venture out to the countryside. Many rural parishes, or even not so rural, but outside of the urban centers, are dependent upon non-resident retired clergy who cannot be expected to give the time and energy of a full-time rector who is a real and integral part of a community. It is a godsend that these clergy are willing and able to care for parishes, but it is very much in the breach. It is very hard for a parish to grow, reaching out to the water buffalo farmers, the artisans, and so on, under such circumstances. So here we are in 2021, with many congregations, both rural and urban, struggling to survive. There is no question that church buildings cost money to maintain, let alone to build. Our experience of restoring St. George's over a 6-year period in the 1990s was an almost indescribable challenge, even though we had the advantage of a beautiful heritage building, which many outside the parish wished to support. In these days, one often hears conversation about moving forward without a church building. And in some ways, the switch to virtual worship has been an example of that, for good and for ill. It can be pleasant just to click on the computer and check out various services here and there around the world. But what does that do for Christian fellowship? What does that do to encourage people in love of neighbor? Not just the neighbor we meet socially at various clubs and organizations, but the broad diversity of human beings that make up a congregation. Is virtual worship, in fact, really worship? Or dare I say, a form of entertainment? No doubt it is different for different people. It does bring with it opportunities for people to visit their friends and their friends' parishes, but it brings little in the way of commitment to God and neighbor. My caveat here, however, would be that if you are watching a beloved and familiar worship service in your own parish church, it can be, at the very least, a real and helpful connection to your parish home. But it does not bring people together for worship of the living God, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together, according to the exhortation found in the book of Hebrews. But as we all know, the Church of God is never just a story of unmitigated doom and gloom. Even a cursory glance through church history shows us the dire situations in which Christians have often found themselves, and which they have faced with steadfast devotion. And so it is in our own very different way in rural Nova Scotia. In many or most surviving congregations in the countryside, there are remarkable, faithful lay people who are quietly carrying on, in some cases against all odds. How they can best be supported is an agonizingly difficult question, but is one which certainly needs attention. An important focus is very frequently their church, not because they worship the building, as some might say, but because for them it is a sign of God's presence in their community. As Christians, we do live by signs and symbols. They would regard the care of their church as simply good stewardship of the sacred, as embodied in that particular place. And finally, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we also have to consider the impact of the COVID pandemic on the life of parishes, especially parishes which might already have been struggling prior to being shut down due to the pandemic. The people who have suffered through isolation during this time, especially those who live alone, may find it difficult or even frightening to reintegrate into society in general and their parish church in particular. The lengthy closure of church buildings and the lack of contact with fellow members of a congregation may lead to a falling off in the desire to attend church and a general lessening of commitment to communal parish life. As I said previously, many people have adjusted to watching worship services in the comfort of their own homes, so there may be some reluctance to return to in-person worship. In many cases, the shuttering of churches for protracted periods has resulted in dropping finances and smaller numbers in the congregation when in-house services have resumed. The virus has kept us apart, including keeping the clergy from visiting the faithful in their homes just at the time they have needed comfort and company the most. It has kept us in our own homes and in our own heads. As the rigors of the shutdown are relaxed, the time is ripe for the human connections which mean so much to us to be resumed, and one sincerely hopes renewed and refreshed. I began this paper with a story of triumph over tragedy, the restoration of this beautiful church, and the renewal of its life and witness in its inner city neighborhood. Now, how shall I bring it to an end? Neither with a bang nor a whimper, but just a wish. We often comment that things move in cycles, and indeed in my own lifetime, I have seen my beloved rural summer parish go through several highs and lows. So I will end with an expression of hope that God's providence will open a way for small rural parishes to survive until a time may come again when they may thrive.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that paper. And now, as always, after a paper, we take a brief break of approximately 5 minutes. For those watching Zoom, we resume, no pun intended, resume at 5 minutes past the hour, whatever time zone you're in, at 5 minutes past the hour. We'll resume now after our 5 or 6 minute break, or however minutes it was, and however many minutes it may have been. And at this point, we will have, in a moment, call upon Reverend Dr. Thomas Curran. It's been a tradition for the last number of years now at our conferences to have what we call the conference summary, in which Father Curran, in a very marvelous way, I think, ties together everything that's been said in any given conference and then sums it all up. So we look forward now to hearing from Dr. Curran. I think almost everyone here present knows him, perhaps some out in line do not. Father Curran teaches at King's College here in Halifax. He's a member of our Theological Conference Planning Committee. He's a colleague of many of the people present in this building this afternoon. He is a parishioner here at St. George's Church. And he remarked to me that he's been fortunate to hear many of the speakers at the Theological Conference over the years. So we'll now call upon Dr. Thomas Curran.
I'd like to say that in past conferences, there is a hiatus between Friday afternoon and evening and Saturday morning when we resume. And perhaps some of the conference speakers, having fulfilled their duties, are able to sleep, but I don't, because I'm trying to assemble all the things that I've heard. And I'm afraid that the lunch break wasn't quite adequate to do what I intended to do. So you will have to suffer, silently, of course, but in prayerful, pious respect, the remarks that follow. I should say that I have always in the past tried to extract from each of the addresses and also even the sermons and comments something that is relevant to all of us, but I'm defeated this time. So if your contribution is not immediately recognizable, please understand that it has been taken into consideration. And I also want to say that the conference proceedings, of course, allow all the speakers to sharpen what they've said relative to comments, but also one of the great beauties of this conference is that the speakers often develop their thinking as the conference proceeds in respect to one another. So whatever goes wrong now can to some extent be recovered through the proceedings. And I just start off in a very flippant way. We had space, place, and grace. Father Curry added face, and I wanted to add my own flippant thought. I suppose what I really wanted to say was space, place, grace, face, lace, in the sense of the veil of the temple, rent in twain, and then I discovered efface was also necessary. Now, I discovered in the attempt to try and put all of this together in some way that was coherent and useful and possibly even comprehensible, that probably the best way for me to proceed is within the cathedral of the work that we represent as the comedy of Dante, which was begun in the year 1307. And I remind everyone that it was completed before his death, possibly early as 1319, but this is the year of his death, and therefore, that is to say, 1321, 700 years later is the anniversary of his death, and it seems appropriate to structure some of my remarks around what he has said. Please note that I am able to steal any comment from anywhere at any time. And so I overheard Dr. Driver speaking to Neil Robertson and explaining that the Psalter could be regarded as a temple of words. Please note that in every discussion of Dante's Divine Comedy, it is understood not to be a temple, but a cathedral in the Gothic sense, in which a great art historian has explained that the Divine Comedy seeks to bring together everything that is received from all traditions, most comprehensively, of course, pagan and Christian, but not exclusively, that the Divine Comedy seeks to bring together all the strands of the traditions from which he has been formed into one great edifice soaring up to heaven. There were some, shall we say, shocking remarks proffered even by our speaker on the cathedral, in which he suggested that there was moving towards us a vision of a first nominalistic and then Protestant world that was emerging at the very end of the Divine Comedy's vision. I nearly fainted, but I held it together. And I assume what he was getting at in saying that was that he was rehearsing a view that has appeared very famously in the preface to the philosopher Hegel's Philosophy of Right, written in 1821. And just a parenthetical and sarcastic, bitter remark. Please understand that I'm quoting something that Hegel actually wrote himself, as opposed to cobbled together lectures that were produced after his death and which are thought to be definitive in a way that his actual words are not, would be making the commentary of the Bible superior to the Bible itself. In this famous preface, written in 1821 for students, by the way, at the University of Berlin, he suggests that the reason that Plato wrote his Republic was that the civic way of life, which Plato celebrated and in which he saw the greatness of the polis, that way of life had disappeared. And so he had to recover in thought what was no longer a reality. In the same way, presumably, Dr. Robertson was suggesting maybe that in providing a summa of the whole body of corporate thought that we might regard as Gothic or scholastic, by bringing it all together in a way it had already superseded itself. And there is a way in which that is immediately true, in the sense that the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is one of the key foundation stones of the entire Divine Comedy, having learned from Dr. Krauss, who's been mentioned frequently, the structure is built on the basis of Aristotle, Virgil, and St. Thomas Aquinas. Not exclusively, of course, but in very profound ways that is true. And you'll remember that Thomas Aquinas died in 1274, didn't live long enough to see some of his propositions actually condemned by the church, so that when he has the vision in 1300 and then proceeds with the beginning of the writing of his Divine Comedy, 1307, he could indeed be quoting Hegel and saying, a way of life has grown old. He is perhaps recapturing in thought something that is no longer present. I think Dr. Elson suggested to us that if one lived in Paris in a certain way, one was already in the presence of a temple. And so our architecture and our buildings are, of course, repositories of what we regard as most important, most celebrated, and most indicative of the kinds of lives we want to live. I suppose as we prepare for death-defying struggle between England and France in the World Cup, provided that England beats Germany with another issue. But if we were thinking about a world historical struggle between England and France, then Notre Dame de Paris must also be put in the context of Durham Cathedral, dedicated to Mary the Virgin. And it was a very humbling moment in my life. Just met an ordinary citizen in Durham who explained to me that his goal in life was to purchase a house which had a view of the cathedral. I don't really want to say any more about what these buildings, St. George's, represents to us, because Susan's already quoted those who live here and work here and wish to be able to see the building. But it is something that we need to address relative to our conference, our hopes, and our dreams. One of the points that emerged beautifully, I think, in the conference is that if we can transform courage into hope, remember that the heaven of Mars was central both to what Neil said and also what Ria commented upon. And there the discussion was in terms of the Song of Roland, or the hero of the Song of Roland, the poem. Neil said quite correctly, seen from a from a conservatively worldly perspective, the Song of Roland is actually a tragedy. The Christian hope is to turn tragedy into comedy in some fashion or other, hence the divine comedy. Remember that Roland refuses 3 times to do what is rational, and that is to blow the horn and to retrieve the bulk of the army of Charlemagne, so that the attack and the overwhelming of the rear guard, of which Roland is the head, can be saved from total and utter destruction, which Oliver points out to him right from the start. I'm going to say something kind of in defense of Roland. He isn't completely without any sense of tactics, but that is not what is moving him. So the first time he refuses to blow the horn, it is because he's stubborn and prideful, and basically the position is no infidel will tell him what his duty is. The second time he refuses to blow the horn, it is because he is in principle open to the possibility of a divine miracle. See, if you act entirely in terms of human tactics and strategy, there's really no reason to invoke God. But for Roland, living in some kind of strange, Romanesque, pre-Gothic universe, it may be, following traditions that we have from the Hebrew scriptures, that God will intervene in the battle and thereby demonstrate his glory, and he, Roland, and all the soldiers present can be instruments of God's grace. And it is only when the third option is presented to him, he also takes the view that if we treat people as enemies, we make them into enemies. If we treat them as cowardly, we turn them into cowards. We give them permission. It's only when the battle has been completely and utterly lost that he blows the horn. And here, Oliver, his friend, takes the view that this is an insane last gasp of breath, which has no purpose. For Roland, he has fulfilled his duty, which was to serve as the rear guard of Charlemagne's army. And if he blew the horn, the first sign of trouble, he wouldn't be the rear guard of the army. The army would be there to protect him, complete reversal of roles. So you know that he could be described in forms of the virtue of the mean as reckless, but he has a courage which will be transformed into hope, as our correspondents told us in the course of the conference. Now, this is not a complete vision of Christian ethical behavior. It's just a moment in a whole spectrum of possibilities. And I'm not even particularly representing it to you, but what I am suggesting is that in all the contributions that we've had, each of those moments must be respected in the totality of what we hope to achieve in our lives. We have heard another quite distressing moment for me. A Calvinist inform us that he needs to have an opportunity to say the Angelus in the King's College Chapel in order to make the final ascent into heaven. These are words that are very distressing to me because I have a significant Protestant background myself and felt that while I mumble the words, of course, perhaps I have still some kind of retention of some other position. But Calvin explained in his interpretation of Scripture that our jobs are to push our interpretations as far as they can possibly go, revealing each and every codicil that is required, and for the rest, let God work it out. We have failed, in my opinion, to push our agenda to its furthest point. But as miserable Anglicans, there is something very profoundly available to us, which is we know we're not right. So in pushing our agenda to the limit, we are asserting that what we stand for needs to be there in the final mix without denigrating anybody else's position, which also needs to be present as well. We just don't want to disappear in a vat. Now, I'm going to quote S.T. Coleridge twice because of his profound insight, which enables us to put all this material together. The first thing he says is, people are right in what they assert and wrong in what they deny. And I think that is why it's okay to be an Anglican. Because we know we can't deny any other position. Ours is so weak. Yes, it doesn't mean it's worthless. It's just not the entire truth. And the second thing he says, which stands as a condemnation of me, really. In the course of pedagogy, I try to suggest that the best possible essay is not 10 pages of quotations from Homer's Odyssey with a few linking sentences mass paragraphs. And I agree with the students that you could actually get that sort of thing published, because here are famous quotations from the Odyssey which have deeply moved me, but it's not an essay. And so I try to persuade them that some of these quotations can possibly be paraphrased without thereby claiming that they come up to the original. But then I have to give them a standard by which they can choose quotations. And so I repeat again what Samuel Taylor Coleridge said: his definition of poetry is the best possible words in the best possible order. It itself being an example of what he's speaking of, I say there's no better definition. How can anybody improve on that? You just have to quote it. A little unhappy about doing it here, because while my mouth is going up and down, and one of the problems with my position generally is I'm actually listening to what I'm saying, which makes sermons rather difficult, because I know what I'm saying has authority, but then I'm listening to myself saying it, then I feel a little uncomfortable. So I'm agreeing before anybody else makes this comments in the, later on, these are not the best possible words in the best possible order. But then I didn't claim to be a poet either. Now, I have little more to say, which is to say I have 2 hours more to say. But in order to leave you with something that might be helpful, I'm going to restrict my remarks to just a couple further points. The first is, I believe it might have been Ria said that amor is both the means and the substance of the ascent in the Divine Comedy. Is that correct? I believe that's what you said. And Solomon, I thought very helpfully, Neil pointed out his crucial role in the heaven of justice as he pushes us further into Saturn and from the heaven of the sun. So there's this kind of ascent where Solomon is a key figure because, as Neil pointed out, he is both the author of the Wisdom of Solomon and of the Song of Songs, and therefore the eros, which the Song of Songs represents, is contained and is part of the motion upwards in the ascent to heaven. But the Wisdom of Solomon is even in some ways more full of amor. I simply report. So the Wisdom of Solomon suggests that Solomon sought her beauty from his youth up. And as he says, I saw wisdom, the beauty of wisdom. I sought to make her my bride. Now that's, I think, why we sit in churches from time to time. It is an attempt to express in our common lives something that moves us over the course of a lifetime. And where are the opportunities for doing this? As much as I am obsessed, I understand that the World Cup or the European Cup might not, who could say such a thing? But here I am, I'm listening. Okay, I have to agree with myself, apparently. The European Cup is not the most be all and the end all of all human aspirations. Kind of uncertain, but okay, I'm saying it. And therefore you are, in a sense, looking for something that isn't annual, but rather beyond the annual, even as the church, through its feast days and through the regularity of the Sundays, turns the years into, as the poet says, fellow travelers of eternity. I'm going to quote Hegel again. It won't happen again in this lifetime, I promise. Never twice in any address. But he does make a point which I think about probably every time I step into St. George's, where the Nicene Creed is never abandoned in Holy Communion. Some services in other places, which are on ordinary weekdays, feel that maybe this part of the service is not central to everything that happens. So sometimes it's omitted. I mean, it's shocking even to mention this. Whereas last night it was beautifully accompanied. But what Hegel says about it is really so amazing. He says, I suppose he was thinking about a world in which children were prepared for confirmation by being introduced to the rituals of the language and so the formularies of the Christian church, and therefore the creed would be memorized as part of your catechetical training. Same thing could be said about German poetry, as great commentators point out. There's a poem by Goethe, which appears in his famous Faust, and he says every child in a previous educational system is required to memorize this short poem called The König von Thule, which of course was set to music by Schubert and therefore survives forever, not because of its own poetic worth, but because of the musical setting. The commentator said every school child in Germany has been forced to memorize this poem, but not a single one of them understands it because you have to have lived a life in order to see its content. That's what Hegel says about the creed. The child can recite the creed or even recite the creed from memory, but it takes a whole lifetime, like that of a Senex, who now at St. George's permitted to recite the creed every time he comes to church. Like the Senex, invests in the repetition of the creed, all the aspects of his life all gathered together, as it were, a Wagnerian leitmotif. Now, I don't want to end on too optimistic a note. That would be wrong, because we have all kinds of things that we have to face. So I'm going to suggest that you have courage. And if you listen to Neil Robertson, you'll discover that the end of courage is hope. I'm sort of on the Aristotelian side on this, which is courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. And this is why I brought up Roland. Oliver is, of course, his companion and the person who suggests that rational behavior is perhaps a means of the divine order providence. I have to say on the other side, in an age of statues, that apparently in terms of secular statuary in public squares and towns all over the ancient Holy Roman Empire, Roland was the single individual who received the most statues in the history of medieval Europe, if we exclude, of course, religious figures explicitly and saints, specifically also in church spaces and in ecclesiastical settings and cathedrals. Occasionally, Oliver appears as his companion, but not all that often. Susan has reminded us of the tragedy of the burning of this church and the response of the parish and the nobility of the feelings that were stirred up both in disappointment and in hope. To say this area suffered from a world famous event called the Halifax explosion, at the time, the greatest explosion that had ever taken place anywhere. Not exactly something one wants to celebrate. Oh yes, visit Halifax. More dynamite was exploded here than anywhere else up till the Second World War. And Henry Roper, who is a member of this congregation, actually met a woman who lost her entire family, I can't remember, but possibly 8 to 10 people. who became a friend of his mother's and who never talked about what it was like to survive. So I'm going to offer a contrast between two positions, which basically say the same thing, and they're not very optimistic, I guess. The first is Oedipus the king, probably the most famous surviving Greek tragedy. Certainly everyone's heard his name. And Cicero, by the way, also has a formula which says the same thing, but essentially what you're told at the end of Oedipus the king is no one should count any day happy until he has lived the last day of his life, because the last day could be so horrific and so unbearable that it wipes out every single day earlier. Once there was the Halifax explosion and the woman I mentioned, the people who died are not in pain, but she certainly was in pain. So of course, there's an immediate remedy for pain. Don't have to say what it is. And you can not be in pain if you wish. And you do not have to anticipate that final day in which all the hope and joy and comfort of life is expunged, possibly horribly. And then you become an Epicurean, not in the vulgar sense, but in the proper sense, which is there's nothing to fear in death because you will no longer be in pain. Now, then you have possibly one of the most famous lines in the whole of the Divine Comedy, uttered by Francesca in the 5th canto of the entire comedy, so very early on, in the incontinent circle of the lustful, who says very simply in words that can't be bettered either, there is no sorrow greater than in days of misery to rehearse moments of joy. And if you are moved at all by this discussion of the Divine Comedy and Mars in particular, and the fate of Roland, and how courage can be transformed into hope under grace, then I would encourage you in your sorrow at all the events that we've been discussing and the difficulties of COVID and the future of our churches and our incapacity apparently to make a dent on the social fabric in which we find ourselves because we are governed by forces beyond our control. And even the course of our lives is sometimes seems to be beyond our capacity. Nonetheless, if you are prepared to see amor as both the means and the substance of ascent, and as you grow older with our congregations in our Christian churches, if you can combine Aristotelian courage with the Christian virtue of hope, maybe it's possible that you might be able to age with a knowledge that no matter what happens, the pain of the future is not going to wipe out the happiness of the present. The reason I have to think about this all the time is my mother is now at a very advanced age, and I've had to develop certain arguments in order to resist hearing every time I see her that time has run out and that she's fed up and it's ready, right moment to go. And can I say that I have heard at least 12 times in a row over the years, not weeks or days, you will not be seeing me again. And then, of course, we have to set up, the whole thing starts over from the beginning. And all I can say is, dear mother, there were so many good days in between. I realize they are shrinking, but you don't regret them. Finally, breaking my own promise. Hegel wrote one of the finest letters of condolences that anyone has ever written. A child of a colleague and friend died 3 days after being born. And the letter is quite personal because Hegel explains that he was caught up in committee meetings or filling out his tax forms or being on a Zoom meeting. I mean, just fill in the blanks, yes? And so he had no chance to hear of the tragedy that had befallen this other family. So he has a moment in the garden, drafts a letter in which he says, if I had heard of your sorrow earlier, I would have, of course, come to see you immediately. It's now too late in the day. But he says, the only question that you have to ask yourselves as parents is, would it have been something you wished that this infant had never been born and you would never have had the opportunity even to love this child for 3 days? So, when you're thinking about your churches and our lives together as Christians and your hopes and dreams, please remember that your courage under the grace of God can be converted into hope. And therefore, whatever you're facing in the year to come. Well, first, there's been some good stuff. And second, you can bear it.
Thank you, Dr. Curran, for the conference summary and for sharing those thoughts with us. Now we proceed to have a question and answer period, and we have to see, are there any questions, Jordan, on the?
There is one.
We have one. Is that the one that's?
From the Reverend David Angel.
I'm not seeing it there, I don't think. Is that one up here? From the Reverend David Langell. Thank you for your presentation. Faith and the hope it inspires leads me to ask a question and offer a comment. First, my question: what are the bright lights, examples of thriving parish churches in rural Nova Scotia, and what can they teach us? Second, in my ministry experience, I have come across several resources that have helped smaller congregations I've served to be viable. One is Fresh Expressions of Church, but for sacramental and local parish church spaces. I stumbled upon the Sanctum Collective in the Church of England. They readily share resources and stories, and everything they do is free, and he gives a link, a website to look at. Does anyone want to attempt to answer Father Langell's question? Or should we just ponder it? Certainly a question worthy of thinking about, indeed. We have no volunteers to answer the question. Are there other questions there, Jordan? Not at the moment. Okay, anyone of those present here in the building, anyone who wishes to make a comment or ask a question of one of the speakers today, or some of the other speakers from earlier in the week who also are present in the building. Dr. Driver?
I'll attempt a comment. Maybe even a response to the response. Just a brief one.
So I think I want to pick up on the thing that you overheard me saying and pick up on a couple of the threads that you couldn't gather. There was a lot going on. One of the things I find quite refreshing about being in this space is being made to sit and not be able to click off to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. And some of the things that people have brought up have marinated a little bit. So Dr. Cleveland taught us the Hebrew word makom for place and showed us some of the places where that shows up. I think I heard Dr. Harton say in response to that, is not scripture a kind of place? Maybe if you're around, you can sharpen that if I haven't remembered that correctly. I was thinking about those comments. I was thinking especially about one comment at the end of my paper on that evening where somebody at the very end of the session said, what does this have to do with the conference theme? A just question. I think I also see that there's work to be done, and there's something really productive about opening ourselves up to very different approaches. It's a very kind of a loose set of papers, and that can be, I found that to be quite useful in this case. So let me talk a little bit about scripture as a place, partly in response to your comment, and also with this idea of the Psalms as a temple of words, which is connect especially with Ria's comments about the midpoints, the structure in the Divine Comedy. The question that I need to ask next about Psalm 51 is, what does it mean for David to repent before the broken walls of Jerusalem? What is going on with that kind of juxtaposition? We kind of slip out the top and move into this, the Miserere Mei. What does it mean for David there in a context of Nathan's prophecy against him, of David's murder of Uriah the Hittite, of Bathsheba, to then enter into a kind of penitence that hopes for the restoration of Jerusalem, which wasn't even finished yet when he was alive. Right? There's something out of time that happens there. And I actually think that the answer that I want to work towards, and I'll have to work towards in my revised paper, is there's a hint of it in Cole Harton's response that says, is not scripture a kind of place? Does it not provide a kind of space? That Psalm 51 ends, do good to Zion, build up the walls of Jerusalem. What would it mean for David to pray that? That's a strange thing. And so there's something about this phrase that comes from Bernd Janowski at Tübingen of the Psalter as a temple of words. And I think the subtitle to that essay is something like the theological architecture of the Psalter, right? So there's something like a cathedral, or to use pre-Christian language, a temple. And it reminds me of Genesis 22, where you have distance from things. And one of the things that's maybe out of sight for us a little bit, being in a restored church, is the vision of things that we've been talking about a little distantly, that is a fear that things will go away forever. And there's something built into the experience of the scriptures of Israel, which is about the removal of place, or the removal from place, ultimately exile. So that you have, in Genesis 22, the famous story of the binding, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, or the near sacrifice of Isaac, you have in that a call to Abraham, and Abraham says, here I am, locating himself, I suppose, first before God. And God says, get up, take your son, and go to the land of Moriah, to the place that I'll show you in one of the mountains out there in the land of Moriah. And a few verses into that story, 3 days into the journey, Abraham lifts up his eyes and he looks to the place Medahok from afar. And then a few verses later, he gets there and we have the moment. This place Moriah is one of several names for Jerusalem traditionally. Now, what it means in Genesis 22 is a good question, but you have this kind of stacking up of Jebus, the Jebusite city, on top of that Salem. I think Dr. Cleveland mentioned Genesis 14, where you have Melchizedek. He did, I remember hearing about Melchizedek, right? So you have Genesis 14 and Melchizedek meeting Abram then before the name change at Salem, and they break bread and there's a tithe, right? So Jebus, the Jebusite city, Salem in Genesis 14, Moriah in Genesis 22, if you want to associate that as the Jewish tradition does, Jerusalem, Zion, all of these names stacked up on top of each other become, in a way, lifted into a cathedral of words in the Psalter and more broadly even in the scriptures, so that the scriptures are configured in such a way to provide a place when the place is gone. That's what I need to say in my conclusion that I haven't written yet. That individualism, right, which in the Romantic sense was trying to provide a place, dislocated something from the place that was already provided. And so there's something in the scriptures which, when a church is burned and doesn't come back, provides something instead. I actually think that's the way the scriptures are often built. Certainly the Psalter, with David, King David, praying for Jerusalem in exile or after the exile. What sense does that make, except in some other register of prayer that uses time and space when it is sort of broken and taken into other places? I think the absence of space is something that several of our conversations, Dr. Ellison talking about this and me reflecting on my own experience through a phone, right? In 2019 of a place that I've been to but haven't been back to since and haven't been to for a while. That absence of space is this further element for consideration and reflection that is brought to me actually in a way by being back in the presence of other people. It's one of the things that's been missing. So anyway, there's my response to your response. And thank you again so much for the invitation to participate in this. I found it very refreshing and challenging in a variety of different ways.
Thank you, Dr. Driver. Now, do we have any other questions or comments? Anything else, Jordan, coming in on the feed? No, okay. No one remotely is asking any questions. Any comments or questions from anyone else before we wind down? Okay, hearing none, I guess we should move to the conclusion then.